Hey, it's Mike here, and today another bone study, this time one out of Germany, that looked at various bone quality metrics, as well as a bunch of different biomarkers. So we've got an interesting study here, however, of course, the media, including the Daily Mail, has decided to make it into a really big thing, totally miscategorizing the science. So we're going to look at what claims really can and can't be made here, how much of a difference there really was. Now, did the vegans actually have such poor nutrition that their bone health was poor? We're going to investigate the science together. And really, if you're a vegan who isn't even interested in the bone issue, there is a lot of interesting blood biomarker stuff, including ones that just demonstrate that vegans are getting certain nutrients under control even more, which is nice to see. So let's bone up on some research. Yes, that's a real saying, and it actually is pretty accurate here, defined as try to master necessary information quickly, which is perfect, so let's go. So the media attacks vary in terms of how aggressive they are. From this newsbreak.com site, which does not look very credible, they said, vegan diet does lead to poor bone health, says German study. Of course, does lead to implies causation, which is impossible here because it's a good time to mention this is an epidemiological study. It's just looking at a snapshot in time. There is no intervention. It's not a randomized controlled trial, so you can't determine causation. Anyway, it gets even worse with the Daily Mail, aka Daily Fail, with bad news for vegans. Following a meat and dairy-free diet leads to weaker bones, all caps, science warns. Why do these Daily Mail titles sound more and more like some drunk guy just shouting at you on the street corner, probably as they throw their McDonald's at you? Anyway, again, horrible journalism because it's implying causation, which I just covered. And the subheadings of that article even include a few nutrients that they claim vegans were deficient in the study, and we're going to absolutely talk into that. It's important to just frame this with something that was later on in the article that hasn't made it to any titles, and that comes directly from the president of the organization where the research took place. Quote, scientific evidence suggests that a vegan or vegetarian diet may protect against many chronic diseases, for example, diabetes and cardiovascular disease or cancer. So even if you do want to grant that vegans might have slightly worse bone health, which we're going to investigate in a second, these are still our leading killing diseases vegans are doing better in. So from a total health perspective, this is not an argument against veganism. Anyway, let's take a look at the actual study. This is a study in the journal Nutrients. It is, again, a snapshot in time. They did not give people an intervention. It's 36 vegans, 36 meat eaters, and they use some ultrasound technology to estimate bone quality, and they also looked at a bunch of different biomarkers, things like inflammation or things like various nutrient levels to determine if there was a connection or not. They did a reasonable job of matching both of the groups. They were both roughly the same in terms of age at around 38, in terms of physical activity. They were one BMI point apart, and I'm going to nitpick that one in a little bit, but in general, reasonably well matched. The two main bone metrics here were BUA, or broadband ultrasound attenuation, and SOS, or save our souls from all of this ridiculous media spinning. I mean, speed of sound, the speed at which sound travels through the bones. One thing that I do not see reported enough, not enough emphasis, there was no meaningful difference between the vegans and the meat eaters in terms of the speed of sound metric. They were both up in the high 1500s. Worth noting, but when looking at the BUA, the vegans were about 5% lower. The vegans were at 111.8, and the meat eaters were at 118. So does this qualify as poor bone health for the vegans, as that Newsbreak whatever site said? Is this 5% difference clinically relevant? It's important to note that this was a measurement of the heel bone, and so looking around at the literature on BUA measurements of the heel bone, we can see that this is actually still a really good value. If you look at the Epic Oxford study, the closest age range I could get from this study was 42 to 44, and they're down at around 87. And then if we're looking at people that are a little bit younger, down at around 18 from this study, they're still in the 80s as well. But for whatever reason, all of these people in this German study had very high average bone density, regardless of diet. And yes, those are the same bone measurements, the same metric, and the same units. So I don't know why. We need to talk to some bone experts about this. If you watch my previous bone videos, you know a very important metric is BMI. The more weight you have on those bones, the more stimulation there is for them to become denser and stronger. And so in terms of this study, we have that 1 BMI difference, which is, yes, also about a 5% difference, just like the DOA difference. However, this difference was not statistically significant, largely probably because of the small study size. It is worth mentioning, though, the main values that you see in this study were not adjusted for BMI. They did some other scenarios in the supplementary material we'll talk about in a second. But that number, that 5% difference, no adjustment for BMI. The reason I think BMI is actually playing a role here is because we see a larger portion of the vegan group at a low normal BMI, and that is based on them having a lower BMI on average, but also having a larger standard deviation. So I went ahead and made 2 bell curves to demonstrate these 2 groups, and you can see, perhaps using a cutoff of 24, a lot more of those vegans are in that lower normal BMI range. This is important because the human body has what appears to be a bit of a bone density BMI drop-off, meaning there's going to be more of a dramatic difference on the lower normal end of BMI than the higher normal end of BMI, and you can see that from this chart here. You can see a much more dramatic drop-off between the BMIs like 20 and 25 than, say, BMIs of 25 versus 30. Kind of flattens out. It's also worth pointing out that, again, these are heel samples, which if there's any part of your body that's going to have more pressure and more growth stimulated based off weight, it's going to be the furthest part down in your body compared to something like, say, your wrist. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but I'm just saying it seems that if they properly adjusted for BMI, taking things like this into account, that 5% might become not even statistically significant at all. And it is worth mentioning those 4 total scenarios that they did. The first one, no adjustment, and they had 2 scenarios where they did do an adjustment, including BMI. One of them, no statistically significant difference. Another one, there was a difference, but there were so many factors in there that we don't really know how much BMI was playing a role or whether it was drowned out. So I'd love to just see a BMI adjustment versus no BMI adjustment, especially a more advanced one taking into account the drop-off. But the claim that a vegan diet is going to lead to worse bone health becomes especially questionable when you consider something that Dr. Garth Davis pointed out, that if you're looking closely in the study, the vegans with the densest bones were actually vegan longer, and that brings me to table 3 here. This is where they lumped everybody in the study together and just divided it into thirds based on how dense their bones were, quartiles, as we call them. Not to be confused with turtles, which are bone density champions. Anyway, you can see how many people were vegan in each group, and it also mentions how long they were vegan for, and the densest groups of vegans were vegan for over 8 years. The next one down was 4.9 years, and the lowest density bone group was just 3.5 years vegan. So the longer you've been vegan, the denser your bones are, so you could just take that conclusion and say everybody needs to be long-term vegan if they want to get dense bones. So Daily Mail, how about you put that one in next? And while that was a really compelling trend, it wasn't statistically significant, but it's also worth mentioning the highest bone density group was more male, younger, smoked less, and was more physically active, and physical activity in terms of any lifestyle metric they looked at was the most statistically significant in terms of determining bone density. And for the person who looks at this chart and sees the BMI thing and goes, hey Mike, how come BMI was not statistically significant on here? That means your BMI claims are just total nonsense, blah de blah. The issue here is it's just a small group. It's clear that the lowest bone density group had a lower BMI at 22 point whatever, but looking at all of the large epidemiology we know where we might get a adjustment figure from, you see that very clear relationship between BMI and bone density, lower BMI, lower bone density. So you don't just adjust based off small sample trends, you adjust based off, rules of the human body that we know to be true, regardless of diet. Okay, now let's look at those nutrients and biomarkers, and this brings me right to the subheading of that Daily Mail article. They say, quote, vegans were deficient in key nutrients that typically come from animal products. Such nutrients include vitamins A and B, as well as the amino acid lysine. All right, well, we're going to put this BS to the test. It's just worth mentioning that deficient means that you are below the normal range. It doesn't mean that you are slightly lower than another group. So let's just go nutrient by nutrient. First, we have vitamin A. The normal range cutoff is 0.6 micromoles per liter, and the vegans averaged 1.8. And while they were 0.2 lower than the other group, that is 3 times higher than the cutoff for deficiency, not deficient. B6 normal range cutoff is 20 nanomoles per liter, and they average 67.2 in the vegan group, not deficient. Finally, we have lysine. Normal range cutoff is 94, and they average 128.5, not deficient. Daily Mail is slandering the group known as vegans, and this article needs to be corrected. But to do my due diligence, we have to estimate, maybe some stragglers were deficient. Let's look at how likely that is. Well, they give us the interquartile range, IQR, which just means the middle 50%, gives us a pretty good indication of how that group is spread out. Now, assuming this is a normal distribution, with this information, we can convert that to a standard deviation and then just pump it into a site like this one, statistics site, that can give us a mock data set. Now, looking at lysine, we have an average of 128.5. That interquartile range is equal to a standard deviation of 12.9. And no values were even under 100, absolutely no values under 96. So it's very unlikely, not impossible, that maybe a single person was below, but again, unlikely. And if you do have any level of concern about lysine, a cup of black beans has 50% of your daily value, so just eat more beans. Perhaps someone was slightly lower because they had just gone vegan and just weren't good at eating enough food. That's possible. And if anyone wants to come at vegans for protein in this, it's also worth mentioning that the vegan group had statistically significantly higher levels of glutamine, so you can't claim one and ignore the other. And also in terms of the muscle mass, the vegans had a slightly higher, not statistically significant, but notable trend, slightly higher muscle body percentage than the meat eaters. Also to mention, the media is picking up on something the study did, which was just seeing how correlated various biomarkers were with bone density, not necessarily causal. And a perfect example of how flawed this can be is that one of the ones we say, higher bone density is associated with higher levels of TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which is something you don't want. If you have hypothyroidism and your thyroid is underactive, you're going to make more TSH. It's not a good marker to have higher TSH. You can't go too crazy on any single nutrient that they mention here, because then you'd have to say, oh, well, we want to get hypothyroidism to increase bone quality. At this point, you might be wondering, why haven't you mentioned vitamin D? Why aren't the vegans being attacked for vitamin D? They're always being attacked for vitamin D. And well, that has to do with how the vegans crushed it in terms of vitamin D. Their levels were 40% higher than the meat eaters. Boom, take that. We also know that B12 was brought up a lot. Well, once again, there was no statistically significant difference. The actual blood level of vegans was slightly higher, and also their B12 index score was higher. That's 4CB12, and not statistically significant, but a trend that is nice to see. If you're wondering about calcium, I didn't see a compelling case for calcium differences being any cause of anything here. Anyway, just in terms of two groups, we're going to have one higher in some areas and one higher in other areas. And just rapid firing, yeah, vegans did better with folate, as they usually do, which is good in terms of birth defects. They did worse with zinc, which we've seen before. They also did twice as good with vitamin K1. They did worse with iodine, but still had that lower TSH. They did worse with omegas, but had 30% lower inflammation markers, lower CRP, which is huge. But again, I'm just really happy to see vegans knock out two of those nutrients that they've been criticized for in the past, vitamin D and B12, at least in this small population. At the end of the day, the SOS difference was non-existent, the speed of sound through bones, as well as the BUA only being 5% different, which I once again just have to question the BMI variability between the groups. And we also just can't forget that the longer that people were vegan, the denser their bones were. So the argument against veganism for bone density here becomes a little muddled, very muddled. Again, vegans are doing better where it counts in terms of leading killers. We're doing better in terms of body mass, in terms of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, so on. So general health here, this is not an argument against veganism. And you know what really matters? The most important bone is what is really hard in vegans, and that is their heart bone. What? Because they care about animals. Yeah, that's right. Finally, if you have any explanations here for what's going on or any other insights in the study, definitely share them below. We'll all appreciate it. All right, feel free to like and subscribe, eat beans, hit that notification bell, do some leg workouts so you get increased bone density so we don't have to worry about this in the future. Just crush all of the meat eaters' bone density. Anyway, I'm just rambling, so see you next time.